What's up, everyone? Hope you all did very well in your trials. If you've done your trials, I know some schools were doing them better than others, but from what I gather from your feedback thus far, most of you have completed trials at this point. If you are in New South Wales, if you're in Vic, I'm sure you are ramping up for your final exams. Most of New South Wales now ramping up for the final HSC, although you probably have taken a week or two off just to unwind, which I would advise doing. It's important to recharge. But purpose of this session, just checking in. If you guys are around and have any questions, you want to debrief, you want to check in and ask about any of the questions, how I would have approached certain elements of your exams. So if you want to add in the comments some of the questions that you were faced with, some of the things that you found difficult to answer or adapt to, some of the questions that you found easy, put them in the chat and let's talk about the exam. Let me know how you felt about your exams, or if you have any questions about upcoming exams, now is the time to ask. Anything English related, school related, year 7 to 12, go for it. Put it in the chat and let's go over best approach, what I would have done if I was in your position, and so forth. So let me know how you went in your exams if you're checking in and you have just finished exams recently. Keen to know how you felt about them, even if you don't have the marks back. What modules, what questions have you found most difficult? What sections do you think you need the most help with in the lead up to the finals? So go ahead on the chat. We'll take some questions just to debrief. This is just a check-in. There are a lot of you coming onto the live streams just before the big set of trials a few weeks back, which was awesome to see. I hope that helped. But do let me know how it all went and what is next for you. So any questions in the chat? And we'll go through that. I've also got a Module C question that was in a few schools' English papers. So I'm going to pull it up and just talk about how I would have approached that, because I've had feedback from a few students who said, oh, I found this really tricky to adapt to, especially because it was an imaginative response. It didn't give the option. There's a couple of things to note there, that you can be asked a specific text type for Module C, craft of writing. So we need to be aware of that. So I'll bring up that question in a moment, just seeing if we've got any questions so far for those that have joined. Let me know how you went in the recent exams and what you would like help with. Throw in any questions that you found were tricky, and I will go through those shortly. In the meantime, let's pull up this Module C question and just consider what you could have done to make it work. But I'm keen to hear some of your ideas, some examples of where you think you wouldn't have been able to adapt it, and then I can give you ideas about how you could have adapted it, what to do in certain situations. So let's have a look at that, and then we can see if you guys have any questions. Here we are, Mod C. Okay, so this was a Mod C question from the trials, 20 marks. First thing I look at here is the mark allocation. So I noticed that it's a 12 marker followed by an 8 marker. It's always important to read both of these before trying to think about either of them. You have to read the whole question at first. So first thing I noticed is there's an extract at the top. When Lee came to deliver the very last lines in the play, both the performer and the audience seemed almost to stop breathing, sharing a moment of silence. Okay, so last lines of a play, there's a performer and the audience, they're sharing this moment together. It seems to be tense, emotional. They almost stop breathing. It's silent. Okay, so that's a stimulus. Then the question is, use this line as the stimulus for an imaginative piece of writing that represents a shared experience. Okay, we'll come back to that. Part B, explain how you have used language in Part A to represent a shared experience. So a very, very standard reflection-based question there. Explain how you have used language in Part A to represent a shared experience, 8 marks. And then it says, in your response, refer to how your writing has been influenced by at least one prescribed text from Module C. Also a classic case. So if you had done the preparation that you would have seen me advise and JeddAI advise on the website, on jeddal.com and on the YouTube channel, if you had planned out a reflection draft, 2 paragraphs, 1 stylistic feature in each one kind of key language feature, if you will, in each one, this would have worked perfectly, and you could have used a lot of that in part B. Of course, the key word in both of these questions is shared experience, something shared, okay? Yes, it gives you a stimulus, but again, we need to think very broadly about the stimulus when we come to write it. So now that we know the reflection question is very broad, how have you used language to represent the shared experience in part A? There's nothing too tricky about that. We feel comfortable with that. That's fine. We've already prepared for that. What about part A? Use this line as the stimulus for an imaginative piece of writing that represents a shared experience. Again, okay, we have to represent a shared experience. It doesn't say a shared experience of silence. There's a stimulus above that had silence, but this just says a shared experience. And the thing that threw a lot of students off for this one is the fact that it said imaginative, an imaginative piece of writing. So if you had prepared only for a discursive or a persuasive piece of writing, then you would have struggled with the imaginative. But even the night before, when I was going through questions and we were talking about Module C and how to prepare, I was saying you have to at least have sat down and considered what you would do if you were to be asked only for one type of writing. I literally went through that the night before. You have to consider this possibility, and it came up here. Every student had to do an imaginative. So if you had a discursive planned, you better have hoped that you've at least thought about how you can convert it or adapt it into an imaginative piece, or you have a kind of separate imaginative piece outlined at least, and that you've practiced. So you want to have at least done one practice of each text type, and you want to have at least considered how you could best use and retain a lot of the concepts and the material that you have in your discursive or persuasive and put that into the imaginative. You at least want to be kind of talking about the same thing. Now, so that's the imaginative piece thing. If you had a discursive and you were only prepared for a discursive, then you might have got a bit of a shock when it only offered you the imaginative. But if you had thought about how you could take what you had in the discursive and put it into a kind of setting and have some action going on and just explore one short moment in time that will roughly cover the same concepts and ideas as the imaginative, as your planned discursive or persuasive, you wouldn't have found it that hard. You just would have had to have needed to have sat down and at least thought about it and planned it and maybe had an alternative opening. I definitely would have drafted an alternative opening for that imaginative to set the scene, because now you need a bit of a set-in and you want to be straight in the middle of action and then going into the rest of the piece. So that would have been key. In terms of the stimulus here, how do you use the line as the stimulus? Well, the key thing is it doesn't say you have to continue on from the stimulus line. It is just a stimulus for ideas. It's a stimulus for ideas. You don't actually have to talk about this character Lee. You don't have to have the very last lines in the play. You have to look at the whole line, the whole stimulus, and think, what's the most convenient way to adapt this? We have to think about life. Life is, do I want to interpret this stimulus literally? Do I want to use this stimulus figuratively, is the F? Do I want to be a metaphor? Is this a metaphor for something? The idea of performer and audience sharing a moment. The very last lines in the play, maybe I'm going to use it metaphorically for the very last lines that one says in one's life. Maybe someone's on their deathbed and they're saying the last lines and their audience is their family. You can get creative with how that could work. But you could also internalize that stimulus. This idea of sharing a moment and getting to kind of the last part of something could be a mental exercise. This could be a reflection of someone's thoughts. They feel like they are sharing a moment with someone else, but they could be completely in their head. Someone could actually be in their head thinking about this without it actually happening in the outside world. By the same token, you could externalize the stimulus. That's the E in life. And this could actually be something that is actually happening. Someone could actually be at a play, and this is a little bit like the literal one. Someone could be at a play, and this could be happening in real time. Alternatively, someone could be hearing about a play that they've just been to, and they're telling them about the play. And they said, oh, you should have seen the very end of this play. It was crazy. Everyone was just silent. It was like we were all in it together. And then that prompts something in the mind of the protagonist. And then you relate it back to what you wanted to talk about from your draft piece. And it stays as a motif. It's important that you keep using the stimulus and you come back to this point of reflection about sharing something, right? It doesn't have to be a moment of silence. It wasn't the stimulus, but it just has to be something shared. So a shared experience doesn't even have to be actually shared. Someone could be desiring a shared experience, right? Someone could be writing about something. So for those of you who did a more meta-fictional piece of writing where you wrote about the craft of writing or the craft of creating something, you could talk about the desire to create something for the audience and how you're trying to connect with the audience. You're trying to create a shared experience, but it doesn't mean that the shared experience has to be happening then and there. So for those of you who didn't have multiple characters, that was okay. This is where people get thrown off. You just need to represent a desire for a shared experience. So if you're talking from the perspective of an author or someone who's creating something, you could actually be talking about how they were writing this piece of writing to connect with someone. Maybe they're writing about a shared experience. Maybe they are trying to connect with someone from their past by recreating them in what they're writing or what they're producing. So people can have desires for shared experiences without them actually being there. People can be constructing something that is going to be shared. So happy to work off any ideas or concepts that you guys have for this particular stimulus to see how you could adapt it. So feel free in the comments to throw out some ideas, some concepts that you wanted to use that you don't know how you would have used, or you're not sure how you could have used them for this particular stimulus. So feel free to throw them out. But again, you want to be very flexible with your interpretation of a stimulus like this. It just says use it as a stimulus. So it was quite a generous prompt in that sense. The only tricky thing was it restricted you to an imaginative piece of writing. So again, you needed to have some kind of clear character set in and some level of action. I never have too much action in these short pieces. 12 marks, that might end up being something like 450 words of actual material. So I would just be exploring one single moment in time, a really important moment. And there could be a lot of internal dialogue of the character as well. It doesn't have to be constant action. I have minimal action in a minimal time because it's only 12 marks and you only have like 20 minutes or so to allocate to this. The real key thing here is how could you have used some kind of concept from that stimulus and used it in a meaningful way? And again, there's something about that sharing that's really important. Something about sharing a moment between the creator and the audience. It doesn't have to be a performer. It didn't have to be a play. You could have been creating anything. You could have been a character reflecting on an experience of creation, like if you were a writer or something, and how you shared that with an audience. And the audience doesn't have to be multiple people. Your audience could have been a parent or a friend. So you can be very versatile and flexible with it. You can just call that person your audience. You can get metaphorical with it. You know, if you had a piece about a son's connection with his father, then the father is the audience, right? And the son is the performer, and the son could feel like a performer. So you can actually start to use similes and metaphors to create that connection to the stimulus, and the marker will clearly see what you're doing there. If the son felt like he could never be accepted by his father, right, then the son could feel like a performer. All my life, I felt like a performer. All I wanted to do was share a moment of authenticity with my father. He was the only audience member that mattered. So this idea of living in a performative way, this idea of creating a different persona, this idea of trying to be someone else to impress another person, like a parent. You could do a lot here. You could call anyone that's relevant to your idea an audience, and you can get playful with that and call yourself the performer. You can use those terms metaphorically and use them as motifs all throughout the piece. So look, there's some food for thought in terms of what you could have done with the stimulus. Again, lesson learned for those who didn't even consider what you would do in a situation where you got asked to do only an imaginative or only a discursive or only a persuasive, make sure you are prepared for that in the future by actually sitting down and forcing yourself to write that version of it. And I would even draft up some alternative openings to that piece and how you want to frame it and what your setting would be. And you can make it as kind of consistent as possible with the discursive or persuasive that is your preference. All right, let me know if you guys have any questions. Otherwise, it's going to be a short one tonight. I imagine a lot of you are checked out for a couple of weeks, especially those who just finished trials. So very understandable. For those who are in year 11 or other years and you've got exams and assessments, please feel free to ask a question in the chat and I will be more than happy to help. So if you've got any questions, feedback from exams, any questions you struggled with, ask now. Otherwise, we are going to wrap up early tonight. Any questions, throw them in the chat, even just a hello to check in. Well, understandably, it's going to be that kind of evening. But thank you for those of you who did tune in. I hope that advice helped just on the Mod C breakdown there. That is really important stuff. So do take that on board going ahead into future exams where you've got a craft of writing type piece. And hope to see you all soon. We'll check back in next week, get back into our weekly cadence, and we'll certainly ramp things up as we get closer to the HSC to make sure you're all in good hands. So all the best, have a good evening, and see you soon.